The last thing Tariq Masood ever said to his sister was, "Don't follow the tracks." She didn't know what he meant. She assumed he was delirious, hypothermic, possibly hallucinating from the cold. Because when the search and rescue team finally found him, 41 hours after he had gone missing in the Cairngorms in the Scottish Highlands, Tariq had no shoes. He had no jacket. He was curled against the base of a granite boulder in a hollow of snow, and his lips were the color of a bruise, and his core temperature had dropped so low that the paramedic on the scene, a woman named Fiona Carrick, who had been doing this job for 19 years, later said she had never once recovered someone that cold who still had a pulse. Tariq survived. After 11 days in Regmore Hospital in Inverness, he was discharged. He walked out on his own 2 feet, and for the rest of his life, he refused, absolutely refused, to talk about what happened in those 41 hours. Except once, he told his sister, and she wishes he hadn't. To understand what happened to Tariq Masood, you have to understand who he was before it happened. Because the man who went into the Cairngorms on the morning of November 9, 2019, was not the kind of man who got lost. Tariq was 34 years old. He had grown up in Edinburgh, the eldest son of a Pakistani-Scottish family who had settled in the Marchmont neighborhood when his father, a civil engineer, had taken a job with the city council in the late 1980s. Tariq had spent his whole childhood being the outdoors kid, the one who dragged his younger sister Nadia up Arthur's Seat on Saturday mornings, who could name every bird in the Pentland Hills by the shape of its silhouette, who had, by the age of 22, completed every Munro in Scotland. That's 282 mountain summits over 3,000 feet. He had done all of them. It had taken him 9 years. He kept the logbook in his bedroom, organized by date, with a hand-drawn map on the inside cover and a small note beside each summit name, weather conditions, what he ate, who he went with, if anyone. Most entries said, alone. Tariq was a surveyor by profession. He spent his weeks measuring land for construction projects, reading topographic data, interpreting GPS coordinates. He understood terrain the way other people understood language. It was not an exaggeration to say that Tariq Masood was more comfortable on a highland ridge in November wind than he was in a shopping center or a crowded pub. The wilderness was not dangerous to him. The wilderness was where he went to be himself. So when his sister Nadia, 29 at the time, living in Glasgow with her husband and their newborn daughter, got the phone call on the evening of November 10th, the call from the mountain rescue team telling her that her brother had been reported missing in the Cairngorms since the previous morning. Her first reaction was not fear, it was confusion. It didn't make sense. Not Tariq, not there. That wasn't possible. She found out later, much later, that Tariq had told his friend, an occasional hiking partner, a man named Marcus Bellamy, that he was going up into the Cairngorm Plateau that Saturday. He had planned a solo traverse, nothing technically difficult, a route he had done at least 4 times before, starting from the Quaracas car park, going up over the summit plateau, then descending into Glen Moor by early afternoon. Standard gear, standard route, standard day. He was supposed to be home by 6 in the evening. He never came back down. Marcus reported him missing at 10 o'clock that night when Tariq didn't answer his phone and hadn't returned to the car park. The mountain rescue team from Cairngorm began their search in the darkness, but visibility was near zero. A weather front had moved in during the afternoon, not unusual for November, and temperatures at altitude had dropped to -12 Celsius. They called the search overnight and resumed at dawn the following morning, November 11th. They found him at 1:30 in the afternoon, 41 hours after he had last been seen, no shoes, no jacket, huddled against a boulder less than 2 kilometers from the car park. 2 kilometers, that was how far he had traveled in 41 hours. A man who could cover 20 kilometers in a day over rough terrain had been found less than 2 kilometers from where he started, curled in the snow, alive by a margin so thin that Fiona Carrick, the paramedic, said she genuinely wasn't sure which side of it he was going to land on. Nobody could explain it. Not at first. When Tariq was stable enough to talk, this was on the 3rd day in hospital, when the hypothermia had resolved and the mild frostbite on his extremities had been treated, the consultant who had been leading his care, a Dr. Alistair Grieve, sat down at his bedside with a cup of tea, and asked him what had happened. Tariq was quiet for a long time. He was staring at the ceiling. Outside the window, the city of Inverness was going about its grey autumn business, cars and people and the ordinary machinery of the world continuing as if nothing had happened. "I don't want to talk about it," Tariq finally said. Dr. Grieve told him that was fine, that there was no pressure. But he did gently point out that understanding what had happened, medically, physically, might be important. He mentioned that the rescue team had noted something unusual when they found Tariq. His tracks in the snow, his footprints, which were visible for several hundred meters before vanishing into drifted snow, appeared to loop, to go in circles, more than once, as if he had been walking without any sense of direction, repeatedly returning to points he had already passed. This was puzzling, Dr. Grieve said, because Tariq had been found with his compass still in his jacket pocket. His jacket had been removed and placed very deliberately, it seemed, at the base of a different boulder about 300 meters from where he was found, folded neatly, almost ceremonially, in the snow. His boots had been placed beside it, also neatly, like he had taken them off voluntarily, intentionally. This is a phenomenon that emergency medicine professionals know about. It's called paradoxical undressing. It occurs in some cases of severe hypothermia. As the body's core temperature drops and blood flow to the extremities becomes compromised, the muscles in the peripheral blood vessels paradoxically relax, causing a sudden rush of blood back toward the skin. For a few moments, a hypothermic person may feel intensely, overwhelmingly hot, so they take their clothes off. They are not thinking clearly. They are not in control, but to them, in that moment, taking off their jacket and their boots feels like a completely rational response to an unbearable heat that no one else can see. Dr. Grieve explained all of this to Tariq. He explained it calmly, the way a good doctor explains something that sounds impossible, something that challenges a person's sense of their own experience. He wanted Tariq to understand that what had happened to him was physiological, medical, explainable. Tariq listened to all of it. He nodded slowly. He took a sip of water. "That's not why I took them off," he said. And then he didn't say anything else for 2 more days. The day Tariq left the hospital, Nadia drove up from Glasgow alone. Her husband, Remy, had stayed home with their daughter. She arrived at Raigmore in the early afternoon, signed the paperwork, watched her brother change back into clothes she had brought for him, and walked with him to the car. He looked different. She hadn't seen him since August, and in the 3 months since then, he had lost maybe 6 or 7 kilograms, most of it in the last 11 days, obviously. But it wasn't just his weight. It was something in his face, something behind the eyes, as if someone had reached inside him and turned a dial. And now the frequency he was broadcasting on was slightly, wrongly different. She didn't push him on the drive south. They talked about Remy and the baby. They talked about their parents, who were flying in from Edinburgh that weekend. They listened to the radio. She bought him coffee at a service station outside Perth, and he held the cup with both hands for a long time before drinking it, like he was making sure the heat was real. It was 2 weeks later, at their parents' kitchen table in Edinburgh on a Sunday evening, after everyone else had gone to bed, that Tariq told her. He sat across from her with his hands flat on the table. He spoke quietly. He looked at his hands mostly, not at her, and she understood instinctively that he was not telling this story for her benefit. He was telling it because it was the only way he could survive carrying it, to put it somewhere outside of himself, into the world, into another person, and then try to go on. So she let him talk. The morning of November 9th had been clear. That was what Tariq kept coming back to when he told the story. How clear it was. He had driven up from Edinburgh the previous evening, stayed overnight at a bunkhouse in Aviemore, and woken at 5:30 to check the weather. The forecast showed the front moving in from the west by early afternoon, which was fine, more than fine. He had planned to be off the plateau by noon. There was plenty of time. He set off from the Cairngorms car park at 7:15 in the morning. The sky was pale grey and clean, the air cold and dry, and the mountain was quiet. A Saturday in early November. Most day walkers wouldn't arrive until 9 or 10. He had the mountain to himself. The ascent was straightforward. He was on the plateau by 9 o'clock. Visibility was maybe 10 kilometers in every direction. He could see the whole sweep of the Cairngorms range, south to the Lairg Gru, east toward the Speyside lowlands. He stopped at the summit cairn at 9:22, took a photograph of the view, ate half a sandwich, and began the traverse west. This was his fourth time on this particular route. He had done it in summer, in early spring, in April, with snow still thick on the ground. He knew it the way you know the route between your front door and your local grocery store. Not by thinking about it, but by feel, by the accumulated memory of your body moving through a familiar space. He had been traversing for maybe 25 minutes, comfortable, unhurried, thinking about a survey project he had coming up in Fife, when he saw the tracks. They were in the snow about 15 meters to his right. Footprints, human footprints, heading in the same general direction he was heading, west, toward the descent into Glen Moor. He hadn't noticed anyone else on the mountain that morning. He hadn't seen another car at the car park. But these prints were fresh, crisp edges, no wind fill, which meant they had been made in the last few hours at most. He glanced at them and kept walking. Not unusual. People came up from other starting points. There were multiple routes to the plateau, but 10 minutes later, he noticed the tracks again, except now they were on his left side. He stopped and looked at them and realized they were the same tracks. He recognized a distinctive feature, a slight drag of the right heel that had made a faint smear in the snow. He was now on the other side of them. He had crossed them without realizing it, or the tracks had curved. He couldn't tell which. He checked his compass. He was still heading west. The tracks were heading northwest now, at maybe a 20-degree angle away from his own direction of travel. He watched them run ahead of him for a moment, two lines of prints heading off into a slight dip in the plateau, and then he put them out of his mind and kept going. It was another 15 minutes before the cloud came in. Fast, the way weather moves at altitude in November. One moment there was still a blue-gray horizon to the west, and the next there was just white in every direction, a flat, seamless white that made it impossible to distinguish the ground from the sky. He pulled out his compass again and confirmed his bearing. He slowed his pace. This was exactly the kind of condition he had prepared for, had trained for, had navigated through a dozen times before. He was not concerned. What he was alone. That was the thing about the cloud that got to him slightly. Not the danger of it, but the silence. The way the plateau became, in an instant, a place without edges or reference points. Just him and the snow and the white and the quiet. He was walking for another 5 or 6 minutes when he saw the tracks again. They were directly in front of him, heading in exactly the same direction he was heading. He stopped. He stared at them. The drag of the right heel was still there. These were the same tracks. He turned and looked behind him, his own footprints stretched back into the cloud. He looked at the tracks in front of him, then at his own tracks behind him, and he made a slow, deliberate turn, comparing the angles. They were almost exactly parallel. Someone was walking approximately 10 meters ahead of him, on a bearing almost identical to his own, moving at a pace almost identical to his own. And he hadn't seen them, hadn't heard them. Even in this silence, in this perfect flat silence of cloud on plateau, there was nothing. No crunch of boots, no breathing, no shape in the white ahead of him. He called out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" Nothing. He called again. He waited. Wind, just wind, low and even across the plateau, and the silence beneath it. He stood there for a moment, and then because he was a rational person, because he had spent his entire adult life trusting terrain and his own judgment in it, he made a rational decision. He was going to close the gap. He was going to walk quickly in the direction the tracks were heading and find whoever was making them, because whoever was up here in this cloud, moving alone on a plateau in deteriorating weather, might need assistance. He followed the tracks. The first thing he noticed, and he noticed it within about 100 meters, was that the tracks were not getting any closer. He was walking faster than before, not running but a quick, purposeful stride, and the tracks were still the same distance ahead of him, the same distance, constant, as if whoever was making them was not a person with a body, with weight and effort and breath, but a projection, a moving point that maintained its interval regardless of how fast he walked. He told himself he was misjudging the distance in the flat light. He told himself the snow surface was uneven, and he was misreading the freshness of the prints. He told himself a dozen sensible things, but he walked faster, and the tracks stayed the same distance ahead of him, and the plateau stretched on and on into the white. He checked his compass. He was still heading west, The tracks were still heading west. He was not circling. He was not confused. He walked for what he estimated was another 20 minutes, maybe 25. He tried calling out again twice more. Each time, nothing. And then he stopped because he noticed something he should have noticed sooner. The light had changed. It was slightly dimmer. Not much. Still the flat white of cloud cover. But there was a subtle shift in the quality of it. A graying at the edges that told him time was passing. More time than he thought. He checked his watch. It was 12:47. He had left the summit cairn at 9:22. He had been traversing for over 3 hours. He should have been in Glen More over an hour ago. He pulled out his map. He studied it. He checked his compass bearing again, carefully this time, more carefully than he had been checking. West. He was going west. Except, wait, he turned slowly. The bearing was west. But looking at the map, at the contour lines, at the shape of the plateau, something was wrong. Something in the relationship between what the map was telling him and what the ground was telling him was off in a way he couldn't immediately identify. He felt a first small thread of real unease. He made a decision. He was going to descend. Whatever direction gave him the most shelter and the most reliable contour, he was going to pick a bearing and drop off the plateau and navigate from lower ground where he could find a stream, follow it, get himself oriented. He had done this before. It was a completely sensible plan. He took a bearing, he put the compass in his pocket, he started to walk, and then he glanced ahead of him. The tracks were still there. He stopped. He had not been walking in the direction of the tracks. He had deliberately, consciously taken a new bearing independent of the tracks, and he had started walking on that new bearing, and the tracks were there, directly ahead of him, as if they had moved, as if they were always ahead of him regardless of which direction he walked. He stood very still for a moment, and then quietly he said out loud to the white plateau and the cloud and the wind, "What are you?" There was no answer, but he noticed for the first time that the tracks were slightly different. Not the size, the same boot print, the same drag of the right heel. But the spacing between them had changed. They were closer together now, shorter steps. The steps of someone moving slowly, or carefully, or waiting. He did not follow the tracks. He stood there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 10, and he made himself be still and rational and think. He was a surveyor. He understood geometry. He understood that if you are disoriented in featureless terrain, your perception of direction becomes unreliable, and things that appear to be in one relative position may actually be in another. He understood that his mind might be playing tricks. He understood paradoxical perception in low-contrast environments. He knew all of this. But he also knew that the tracks were fresh, that they were human, that whoever or whatever was making them was doing something that a human being in this terrain, in these conditions, should not be able to do. He took a new bearing. Due north this time. Not west, not toward Glen More, but north, toward a part of the plateau he was more certain he recognized. He fixed the bearing. He kept his eyes on the compass rather than the ground ahead of him, and he walked. He walked for 40 minutes without looking up, keeping the compass needle steady, counting his steps, reciting the multiplication tables in his head, just to give his mind something to do that was not the question of whether the tracks were still there. When he finally looked up, he was at the edge of a corrie, a glacial hollow in the rim of the plateau, bowl-shaped, its far side dropping steeply away into whiteness. He recognized it. He had stood at this exact spot in April 3 years earlier, looking down into the corrie with Marcus Bellamy, eating a cereal bar and arguing about which way to go next. He knew where he was. He was alive. He turned and looked behind him. The plateau stretched back into cloud. His own footprints ran back through the snow, a clear line of them, direct and purposeful. And beside them, not on top of them, not crossing them, but running parallel to them, maintaining a constant distance of roughly 10 meters, running all the way back into the cloud until they disappeared, were the other tracks. He was afraid now, not the cold, intellectual recognition of danger that a trained outdoorsman learns to use as a tool, but real fear, primitive fear, the fear that lives under all the other fears, the one that doesn't have a name because naming it would make it real. He told himself not to look. He told himself whatever explanation there was, it was a natural one. It was something his mind would later be able to explain away with physics and geography and meteorology. He told himself he was going to go down into the corrie, follow the burn at its base, get off the mountain. He went into the corrie. The descent was steep, loose under a thin skin of snow, and he had to concentrate on his footing. It was getting colder. He estimated the temperature at -8 or 9. The wind had picked up slightly. He focused on the ground immediately beneath his feet, on the placement of each step, on the physical reality of rock and snow and gravity. He reached the bottom of the corrie. There was a burn. He could hear it before he could see it, running under a thin shelf of ice, its sound muffled and low. He followed it east along the corrie floor. He was heading in the right direction. He was going to be okay. He was walking along the burn maybe 300 meters when he heard it. A sound ahead of him. Close, maybe 40-50 meters. He stopped. He listened. It was a sound he couldn't immediately place. Not wind, not the burn, not any animal he knew on this mountain. It was rhythmic, almost, but not quite. A faint, soft, repetitive sound that he could feel in his chest more than hear with his ears. He stood very still for a long time, and then he realized what it was, or rather, what it resembled. It resembled the sound of footsteps in snow, slow footsteps, steady footsteps, coming from somewhere ahead of him in the whiteness of the corrie, coming toward him. What Tariq did next, he said later, was the only decision in those 41 hours that he was certain was right. He turned around. He didn't run. The terrain was too uncertain for running, and running uses heat you can't afford to lose. But he walked as fast as he could, back the way he had come, back up along the burn to the base of the corrie slope, and then up, hard, steep, scrambling with his hands, back up onto the plateau. He came over the rim gasping, his thighs burning, and he stood in the flat white of the plateau, and he breathed, and he tried to think. He was going in circles, not through error or disorientation. He understood that now. Something in this part of the mountain was making him go in circles. Whether it was navigational interference, whether it was something in the terrain he wasn't reading correctly, whether it was something else, he did not let himself finish that thought. He sat down in the snow. He put his back to the wind. He made himself go through everything he had in his pack: water, food, emergency bivouac bag, first aid, headlamp, and take stock. He was cold, but not dangerously cold yet. He was tired. He was afraid. But he was functional. He tried his phone. No signal. He had his emergency whistle. He used it. 6 blasts, the international distress signal, and then silence, and then 6 blasts again. He did this for what he estimated was 15 minutes. Nothing came back to him except the wind. He made a decision. He was going to walk in a straight line. One direction, one bearing, unwavering, regardless of what he saw or heard. He was not going to follow anything. He was not going to be drawn off his line. He was going to pick a bearing that would take him off the plateau in the shortest possible distance, and he was going to walk it until he was off, or until he couldn't walk anymore. He got up. He picked his bearing, south-southwest, toward what he estimated was the lowest and most accessible edge of the plateau. He put his compass in his left hand where he could see it without raising it, and he started to walk. The tracks appeared within 4 minutes. They were ahead of him. Same direction, same boot print, same drag of the right heel. He kept walking. He did not follow them. He maintained his bearing even as they curved slightly away, and then curved back, even as they seemed to slow, even as they stopped, about 200 meters ahead of him, at a point where a dark shape resolved out of the white, a boulder, a large one, half buried in snow, and the track stopped at the base of the boulder and did not continue. He walked toward the boulder on his bearing. He had no choice. It was directly on his line. He got to within 20 meters and stopped. There were no tracks on the other side of the boulder, no tracks going around it, no tracks departing from it in any direction. The tracks simply ended. At the base of a boulder in the middle of the Cairngorm Plateau, in November, in cloud, in cold, he stood there. He was breathing hard. He looked at the boulder and he looked at the tracks that ended at its base, and he thought about Nadia, about his mother, about his father, about all the people who were going to have to be told if he didn't come back from this mountain. He walked past the boulder. He kept his bearing. He walked. 20 minutes later, he felt his body start to change. The hypothermia came on slowly, and then all at once. He knew what it was the moment it began. He had read about it. trained to recognize it. The first signs were subtle, a slight clumsiness, a tendency to stumble on ground he would normally have navigated easily. Then a heaviness in his thoughts, a feeling that his mind was operating on a slight delay, like a bad phone connection where the words arrived just a fraction after they were spoken. He checked his compass and found himself having to look at it for longer than normal to understand what it was telling him. He kept walking. The cold stopped hurting, which was the bad sign. It became neutral, and then it became, very faintly, almost pleasant. He was aware enough to know what this meant. He told himself to keep moving. He told himself that as long as he kept moving, kept generating heat, kept walking on his bearing, he was going to be all right. He doesn't remember taking off his jacket. He doesn't remember taking off his boots. He doesn't remember the period of time between walking on the plateau and being found at the base of the boulder near the car park. That time is simply gone. A blank space in his memory where 40 minutes of his life used to be. But he remembers, very clearly, the moment just before the blank space. He remembers stopping. He remembers looking to his right, where the tracks were. And he remembers that the tracks were closer than they had ever been. Much closer, only a few meters, and they were not moving. And in the flat white light of the cloud and the snow, he remembers seeing a shape. Not a person, not anything he could articulate or describe with confidence, but a shape. A density in the white, a place where the air was doing something different from what the air around it was doing. Standing beside the tracks, waiting, he remembers turning away from it. He remembers hearing his own voice say very quietly, almost to himself, "Don't follow the tracks." And then nothing. The next thing he remembers is Fiona Carrick's face looking down at him, and he remembers feeling an enormous physical gratitude that it was a human face. After Tariq finished talking, Nadia sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time. Outside, the Edinburgh street was quiet. An October wind moved through the trees. "Do you think it was real?" she asked. Tariq considered this for a moment. Then, "I think it was something." She asked him if he'd told anyone else. A therapist, a doctor, anyone. He shook his head. She asked him if he planned to go back to the Cairngorms. He said no. She asked him what he thought the tracks were. He was quiet for a while. He looked at his hands on the table. "I think," he finally said, "that the mountain has things on it that are old. Older than walking, older than names. And I think those things aren't necessarily dangerous. I don't think it wanted to hurt me." He paused. "But I think if I had followed the tracks, I would never have come back." She asked him what made him so sure, and he said, because of where they ended, at the boulder near the car park. 2 kilometers from where he had started, the tracks that had been leading him in circles for over 30 hours had, in the end, led him to the nearest road. He had been found within 50 meters of where the tracks stopped. "Then maybe it helped you," she said. Tariq didn't answer right away. He picked up his cup, found it empty, set it back down. "Maybe," he said, "or maybe it just decided it was done." He pushed back from the table and said he was going to bed. She watched him go up the stairs and heard the bedroom door close. She sat at the table for a very long time after that, thinking about the Cairngorms, and about tracks in the snow, and about the thing that lives in the gap between followed and lost. The gap between what the mountain shows you and what it keeps. The gap between coming back and not. In the end, she turned off the kitchen light and went to bed too. But she left the hall light on. The way you do when you're not quite sure that outside and inside are as different as you've always assumed. I've done a lot of research on accounts like Tariq's. And what's interesting is that the Scottish Highlands, and the Cairngorms specifically, have one of the highest concentrations of unexplained disappearance and survival stories in the world. Not because the terrain is uniquely deadly, although it is serious terrain that demands serious respect, but because of the quality of the disorientation people describe. Over and over again, in accounts spanning 2 centuries of mountaineering in the Cairngorms, from Victorian-era Alpine Club records to modern mountain rescue logs, people describe the same experience. The sense of being led, the sense of something accompanying them, the sense of tracks that cannot be accounted for by any other person on the mountain. Psychologists and neurologists have explanations. They talk about hypoxia-induced hallucination, about the psychosis of extreme cold, about the mind's desperate need to impose pattern on chaos when all other navigation has failed. They're probably right. Physiologically, scientifically, They are almost certainly right. But Tariq Masood was not hypoxic when the tracks first appeared. He had been on the mountain for 2.5 hours. He was well-fed, well-rested, well-equipped, and moving with purpose and control. The tracks appeared before the cold became dangerous, before the cloud closed in completely, before any condition that might explain them. The search and rescue team's incident report, which I've read, notes that Tariq's footprints were recovered in a partial circle in the area around the corrie before becoming too drifted to trace. Beside his tracks, in several places, the report notes what are described as indistinct parallel impressions in the snow, possibly wind erosion, which appeared alongside Masood's confirmed footprint trail for approximately 200 meters before losing definition. The report classifies these as a weather feature. Nobody followed up on them. Nobody went back to look. And I think that's wise, because there's a thing about the Cairngorms, about all wild places actually, the ones that have been here longer than we have, longer than any of our words for them. There is a thing they have in common. They don't reveal themselves to the curious. They reveal themselves to the lost. And even then, what they show you, and whether you come back from it, and whether the thing that walks beside you in the white is trying to save you, or simply waiting to see which way you'll choose, that's not something any report can classify. That's something you'd have to go up there yourself to find out. And if you do, if you ever find yourself on a plateau in the cloud, and you see tracks in the snow beside you, tracks heading in the same direction you're heading, tracks that are always the same distance ahead, tracks that should belong to someone but don't follow them. You probably already know what happens to people who do.